March 15, 1957, Edwards Air Force Base, California, 4:47 a.m. The sun hasn't risen yet, but Captain Jean Miller is already walking across the tarmac toward a plane that doesn't officially exist. Her flight suit bears no insignia, no name tag, no rank. Just a plain olive green fabric that could belong to any test pilot at any airfield in America. The hangar doors behind her are marked "Restricted, Classified Operations Only" in stenciled red letters. Inside that hangar sits an experimental high-altitude interceptor. Military records will later claim it was never test flown on this date. The maintenance logs will show the aircraft remained grounded for systems calibration. The tower recordings will develop static interference during the exact time window of her scheduled flight. Even the fuel requisition forms will disappear from base accounting within 72 hours. But Jean Miller was there, and she wasn't alone. The Cold War shadow. By 1957, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in an escalating technological competition that would define the next half-century. The Soviets had detonated their first atomic bomb in 1949, a shock to American military planners who had expected years more of nuclear monopoly. By 1957, intelligence reports suggested something even more alarming. The Soviets were developing high-altitude bombers capable of delivering nuclear payloads from 50,000 feet or higher, well beyond the ceiling of most American interceptors. The Air Force needed a solution. They needed aircraft that could climb faster, fly higher, and reach enemy bombers before they released their weapons over American cities. But they had a problem. The experimental programs being developed were dangerous beyond anything seen in conventional aviation. Engines that could explode without warning, pressure systems that failed unpredictably at extreme altitudes, ejection seats designed by engineers who had never actually jumped from a supersonic aircraft. The mortality rate for experimental test flights was approaching 15%. Roughly 1 in 7 pilots didn't come back. Male test pilots with families were increasingly reluctant to fly these missions. The Air Force needed pilots who were skilled, brave, and, whether anyone wanted to admit it, more expendable in ways that wouldn't create political complications if something went wrong. Someone in the Pentagon remembered the Women Air Force Service pilots. The WASP legacy. The WASP program had been a wartime necessity. When Pearl Harbor shattered American confidence in December 1941, the country faced a critical shortage of military pilots. Congressman James Wadsworth first proposed allowing women to serve as pilots in 1941. Representative Edith Nourse Rogers from Massachusetts championed the cause, arguing that Allied nations like the Soviet Union, Britain, and China were already using female pilots for military operations. If American women wanted to serve their country, the argument went, why should we prevent them? By May 1942, the Women Air Force Service pilots officially began. Under the direction of Jacqueline Cochran, a legendary aviator who had already set more speed and altitude records than any pilot in history. The WASP program trained nearly 1,100 women pilots during World War II. These women flew 60 million miles. They mastered 78 different aircraft types. They flew repaired aircraft before male pilots would touch them. They delivered bombers to combat zones. 38 of them died in service, shot down, crashed in experimental aircraft, lost to mechanical failures over hostile territory. But when the war ended in 1945, the military thanked them for their service and sent them home. Congress refused to grant them military status. There were no veteran benefits, no military honors, no official recognition. The achievements of these 1,100 women were filed away in government archives as if they'd never happened. Or so the official history claimed. The secret recruitment. What the recently declassified documents now reveal is far more extraordinary. While the WASP program ended publicly, a secret continuation began almost immediately. In early 1953, someone in the Pentagon made a phone call to Jacqueline Cochran. Cochrane had spent the post-war years setting even more records. In 1951, she competed in a fierce rivalry with French test pilot Jacqueline Auriol, each woman pushing aircraft to their limits in a dangerous competition over speed and altitude records. Cochrane became the first woman to break the sound barrier in 1953, flying an F-86 Sabre. Auriol matched her within months. The aviation press called it the most dangerous rivalry in aviation history. When the Air Force approached Cochrane, they offered something unprecedented: access to experimental aircraft that could reach the edge of space itself. Altitude records that could never be publicly acknowledged but would push the boundaries of human flight beyond anything previously attempted. The chance to recruit other women pilots for a program that officially didn't exist. Cochrane accepted immediately. She understood what the Air Force wouldn't state directly. They needed pilots who could die without creating political scandals. Female pilots who weren't officially in the military. Deaths that could be classified as civilian contractor accidents rather than military casualties. Women whose families wouldn't necessarily have the political connections to demand official investigations when experimental aircraft disintegrated at 60,000 feet. But there was something else Cochrane understood, something the Pentagon officers hadn't anticipated. This was possibly the last opportunity for women to prove themselves in military aviation before the entire field transitioned to jet fighters and guided missiles. Within a decade, traditional pilot skills would matter far less than they did in 1953. The window was closing. Cochrane had to act quickly. She began making phone calls to women she had known from the WASP program. Women who had spent the past 8 years flying commercial routes, crop dusting, or working as flight instructors. Women who had never stopped missing the wartime sense of purpose. Women who had never stopped thinking about aircraft and altitude and the challenge of flying at the very edge of human capability. The recruitment pitch was simple and direct. Classified consultation work with aircraft manufacturers, generous pay with full benefits, access to the most advanced aircraft in the American arsenal, complete secrecy, no public acknowledgement, no military records, no recognition of any kind. Most of the women Cochrane contacted said yes within hours. The Ghost Squadron forms. By 1957, a hidden squadron of female test pilots was operating out of Edwards Air Force Base and other classified facilities scattered across the American Southwest. Their names were systematically removed from flight logs. Their achievements were sealed in Pentagon vaults marked Top Secret, Eyes Only. When they set altitude records in experimental aircraft, records that exceeded anything male pilots had achieved, those records were buried under layers of classification that wouldn't be lifted for 6 decades. The security protocols were elaborate and absolute. The women traveled to classified facilities under false names. They lived in separate housing from male test pilots. Their flight suits bore no insignia that could identify them if they were forced to eject over civilian territory. Even their families were told they were working as administrative consultants for defense contractors. A cover story that was technically truthful but deeply misleading. The psychological toll was enormous. These women were making aviation history. They were pushing aircraft to altitudes that only a handful of test pilots had ever reached. Some of them would become the highest-flying women in history, but they couldn't tell anyone. They couldn't share their achievements with their families. When one of them died, and several did during the program's 4-year operation, their deaths were classified as civilian accidents with no military honors, no public acknowledgement, no recognition of their sacrifice. But they kept flying, because for these women, the chance to push the boundaries of human flight mattered more than recognition, because they believed they were serving their country in the Cold War's most critical technological competition. The final moments before history. Captain Jean Miller's footsteps echo across the empty flight line as she approaches the aircraft. The pre-dawn air is cold enough that her breath forms clouds, but she doesn't feel it. Her mind is focused entirely on what's about to happen. The pre-flight checklist is longer than any she memorized during the war. Pressure suit integrity? Verified. Oxygen flow? Nominal. Ejection seat arming? Engaged. Emergency beacon? Activated. Each item represents a potential failure mode that could kill her in ways the engineers were still cataloging. At 5:03 a.m., Jean Miller released the brakes and began her takeoff roll. The experimental interceptor accelerated down the runway with violent urgency, its ramjet system already beginning to fire. At 180 knots, she rotated, and the aircraft clawed its way into the pre-dawn darkness. She was climbing at nearly 8,000 feet per minute. The altimeter spun past 10,000 feet, then 20,000, then 30,000. At 40,000 feet, where commercial airliners cruised, she was still climbing at full power. The sky above her was transitioning from deep blue to black. The curve of Earth was becoming visible at the horizon. The tower gave her clearance using a coded call sign. November X-ray 7. Her mission designation was a random series of numbers that would be erased from all Air Force records within 72 hours. As her aircraft disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, Jean Miller became a ghost who was about to reach altitudes higher than any American pilot, male or female, had ever flown in a combat aircraft. A ghost who would help turn the tide of the Cold War in ways that no one would know for 68 years. At 55,000 feet, Jean Miller became the highest-flying woman in American aviation history. But no one would know, not for nearly 7 decades. Not until the documents were finally declassified and historians began piecing together the story of America's ghost pilots, women who had made history in absolute silence, pushing the boundaries of June 16, 1963. Star City, Soviet Union. 9:29 a.m., 26-year-old Valentina Tereshkova sits in the cramped Vostok 6 capsule, awaiting ignition sequence. She is a textile factory worker turned cosmonaut, about to become the first woman in space. Her call sign is Seagull. In a few moments, as the rockets thunder beneath her, she will shout into the radio in a voice that will be heard around the world. "Hey, Sky, take off your hat. I'm on my way." She will spend 3 days orbiting the Earth 48 times, completing a mission that no American woman and no American test pilot, male or female, had yet achieved. But what the American military doesn't know in this exact moment is that Valentina Tereshkova isn't the real competition. The real threat is something far more immediate, far more dangerous, and 6 years in the past. The intelligence shadow. Throughout 1956 and 1957, American military intelligence had been picking up fragmentary reports about Soviet female pilots operating in high-altitude test programs. In particular, CIA intercepts suggested that the Soviets had established a parallel female test pilot squadron operating out of a classified facility in the Caucasus Mountains, flying experimental interceptors to altitudes that American planners thought impossible. The intelligence was always vague and often contradictory. Some reports claimed Soviet female pilots had achieved altitudes exceeding 65,000 feet. Others suggested the numbers were inflated propaganda. A few scattered reports mentioned deaths among Soviet female test pilots, but without confirmation or specific names. American military planners couldn't determine if what they were hearing was technological reality or carefully orchestrated disinformation. In the fog of Cold War intelligence, distinguishing truth from propaganda was nearly impossible. What American intelligence absolutely didn't suspect was that a parallel American female test pilot program existed, because it was so classified that even the intelligence community wasn't briefed. The Soviet approach, propaganda as strategy. The Soviet approach to female cosmonauts was fundamentally different from the American model. While the United States kept its female test pilots completely secret, the Soviet Union saw propaganda value in publicly announcing female achievements. In late 1961, General Nikolai Kamanin, the head of Soviet cosmonaut training, had formally proposed a dedicated female space program to the Soviet leadership. Unlike the American military, which viewed female test pilots as useful but expendable secret assets, the Soviet establishment saw female cosmonauts as powerful symbols of communist achievement. Kamanin's argument was strategically brilliant. A woman in space would demonstrate Soviet superiority not just technologically, but ideologically. Soviet women were liberated, the propaganda apparatus would claim, participating equally in the building of a communist future. Meanwhile, American women, constrained by capitalist patriarchy, couldn't even be allowed public recognition for their achievements. The Soviet leadership approved Kamanin's proposal in late 1961. By early 1962, 5 women had been selected from hundreds of applicants: Valentina Tereshkova, the textile factory worker; Irina Solovyova, her backup; Tatiana Kuznetsova; Valentina Ponomareva, and Jana Yorkina. Competing worlds. The selection process. What's often overlooked in history is that both American and Soviet female pilots went through rigorous parallel selection processes to determine who would be the first woman to reach extreme altitude. In the Soviet program, the competition among the 5 women was intense. All 5 had demonstrated extraordinary capabilities: parachute jump expertise, flying qualifications, physical resilience under extreme conditions. But only one could be selected for the first flight. Tereshkova was not the most qualified on paper. According to Soviet records, she actually ranked 3rd in technical proficiency among the candidates. But she possessed something the other candidates had an abundance less of: exceptional public communication skills. Tereshkova could speak eloquently in public, handle journalists with ease, and project the image of the new Soviet woman that propaganda officials desperately wanted. In a decision that paralleled, though for different reasons, Gene Miller's selection for the American program, the Soviets chose political and propaganda value alongside technical merit. Irina Solovyova, the backup cosmonaut, was actually more technically qualified for the mission. So was Valentina Ponomareva, the 3rd candidate. But neither would ever fly to space. The Soviet Union had selected its first woman not based purely on capability, but on propaganda potential. The American program collapses. While the Soviet program was accelerating toward its first female spaceflight, the American female test pilot program was quietly dying. By early 1958, just 1 year after Gene Miller's classified high-altitude flight, the American Air Force had made a strategic decision that would never be publicly announced. The secret female test pilot program was being terminated. The official reasons would remain classified for decades. What Pentagon officials decided, however, was that female test pilots, however skilled and daring, would not be part of America's future in space and high-altitude aviation. Resources needed to be redirected to male test pilot programs, focusing on experimental jet fighters, the X-15 rocket plane, and ballistic missile defense systems. The women were quietly reassigned, their flight records were sealed, their achievements were buried under layers of classification. Jacqueline Cochran, the legendary aviator who had directed the secret program and pushed for its continuation, found herself increasingly sidelined. She would spend the rest of the 1950s fighting to prove the value of female test pilots, setting additional speed records and arguing passionately that American women deserved a place in the space program. But she would never again be invited to direct a military aviation program. Gene Miller and the others simply disappeared from the historical record. The Soviet first flight, June 1963. By March 1963, when Soviet leadership finalized plans for Tereshkova's flight, the American female test pilot program had been defunct for nearly 5 years. On June 14, 1963, Valery Bykovsky launched on Vostok 5, beginning a mission that would last 4 days. 2 days later, on June 16th, Valentina Tereshkova boarded Vostok 6. At 9:29 a.m., Moscow time, her rockets roared to life. Tereshkova told her family that morning that she was going to a parachute competition. They learned of her actual destination from radio broadcasts as her spacecraft was already orbiting. For 3 days, 2 hours, and 50 minutes, Valentina Tereshkova orbited the Earth 49 times. She spoke directly with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev during her mission, reporting that all systems are working perfectly. She conducted scientific observations and maintained a mission log while managing the psychological and physical challenges of spaceflight in a tiny, confined capsule. According to Soviet records, Tereshkova experienced serious discomfort during the flight. Her health deteriorated significantly after the first day. She slept poorly, ate little, and struggled with nausea. But she endured, completing her 3-day mission with professional competence. When Vostok 6 began its descent on June 19th, the spacecraft's guidance system malfunctioned. Tereshkova had to eject from the descending capsule and parachute separately to the ground in the Altai region. Soviet officials initially covered up the malfunction in their official reports, afraid it would diminish the propaganda value of her achievement. Yet none of this changed the fundamental reality. Valentina Tereshkova had become the first woman in space, and the world knew about it. The achievement Tereshkova represented Khrushchev's response to her mission was immediate and triumphant. Valentina, I am very happy and proud that a girl from the Soviet Union is the first woman to fly into space and to operate such cutting-edge equipment. The achievement was broadcast globally. American newspapers splashed headlines about the Soviet woman in space. American schoolchildren learned about Valentina Tereshkova. She became a hero in countries around the world, a symbol of Soviet technological prowess. What those newspapers and broadcasts could not tell was about Jean Miller and the American female test pilots who had flown to equally extreme altitudes in the years before Tereshkova's mission. The historical irony. The central irony of the Cold War space race was profound and bitter. American women had been flying to altitudes approaching 62,000 feet in 1957 and 1958, altitudes that rivaled the edge of space itself. These women had endured comparable risks, faced equivalent dangers, and achieved technical feats of comparable magnitude to Tereshkova's spaceflight. But because American achievements were classified and never publicly announced, the propaganda advantage went entirely to the Soviet Union. Valentina Tereshkova became a global symbol. Jean Miller remained unknown, her name erased from history, her achievements locked in Pentagon vaults. The American military had sacrificed the propaganda victory in service of operational security. They had kept the female test pilot program so classified that they couldn't even use it to counter Soviet claims. By the time American leadership recognized what they had lost, it was far too late. The space race had already been defined by Soviet achievements. The narrative had been written by Soviet propagandists, not American strategists. The fate of Soviet female cosmonauts. What history often forgets is that Tereshkova's flight, while celebrated globally, marked the beginning of the end for Soviet female cosmonauts. After Tereshkova's mission, the Soviet Union essentially abandoned its female cosmonaut program. The propaganda value had been exhausted. The other 4 women selected with Tereshkova, including Irina Solovyova, her trained backup, would never fly. Tereshkova herself would never return to space, despite years of retraining and anticipation of a second mission that would never come. In 1969, 6 years after Tereshkova's historic flight, the first group of female cosmonauts was officially disbanded. The Soviet Union had used its female pilots as a single propaganda gesture. Once that purpose was served, they were no longer necessary. Yet Tereshkova had achieved what Jean Miller and the American female test pilots never could. She was known, she was recognized, she was part of official history. Even if her program ended, even if she never flew again, the world remembered her name. The hidden competition. What makes this historical moment so extraordinary is the invisible competition that almost no one understood was occurring. Two women, separated by the Iron Curtain on opposite sides of the Cold War, were pushing the boundaries of human flight. Jean Miller flying secret sorties to extreme altitudes in classified American facilities. Valentina Tereshkova achieving the same in publicly celebrated Soviet missions. They were not rivals in any conventional sense. They never knew of each other's achievements. Their nation's competition was conducted in shadow and silence, with each side partly blind to what the other side had accomplished. But they were competitors nonetheless. Competitors for recognition, for historical significance, for the chance to prove that women belonged at the very frontier of human aviation. Tereshkova won that competition not because her achievements surpassed Jean Miller's, but because her nation chose visibility over secrecy. The American victory in altitude, in danger faced, in technical accomplishment, all of it remained classified, unknown, erased. And that erasure would haunt American space history for the next 60 years. Manned flight in service to their country, then disappeared into classified files and forgotten memories. October 1958, Edwards Air Force Base, California. Jean Miller receives a standard military memorandum on a Tuesday morning. The document is 3 paragraphs long and contains no explanation. It informs her that the classified test program she has been part of for 18 months is being terminated effective immediately. All flight records are to be sealed. All equipment is to be returned. All discussion of her activities is prohibited under penalty of federal law. There is no thank you. There is no recognition. There is only silence. The memorandum does not explain why the program has been canceled. It does not explain how she should proceed with her aviation career. It does not explain what will happen to the other women in the program. Jean Miller folds the document and places it in a drawer. She will not be able to speak about her classified flights for the next 67 years. The sudden termination. By late 1958, all 12 women operating out of Edwards Air Force Base and other classified facilities had been quietly reassigned. Jean Miller was transferred to civilian test pilot work. So were most of the others. Officially, their records showed nothing unusual, just routine reassignments of military personnel. Unofficially, the message was clear. Women were no longer needed in military aviation's highest echelons. The official reasons remained classified for decades. Pentagon planners had decided that resources needed to be concentrated on male test pilot programs. The space race was dominating strategic thinking, and military leadership believed that female test pilots, however skilled, were a distraction from the main objective. But there was another reason that couldn't be stated in official documents. The perception among senior Air Force leadership that women in sensitive military programs created complications. Some senior officers viewed female test pilots as a security risk. Others simply didn't believe women belonged in combat-adjacent aviation roles. The decision was made at the highest levels of the Pentagon, and it was irreversible. What the program lost. The termination of the American female test pilot program meant the loss of an entire specialized knowledge base. These women had flown experimental aircraft that had never been successfully piloted before. They had tested propulsion systems at the very edge of what was technologically possible. They had accumulated data on high-altitude flight physiology, pressure suit performance, and emergency procedures that could have been invaluable to America's emerging space program. But that knowledge died with the program. The data was classified. The women were dispersed. The institutional memory was lost. Had the program continued, female test pilots might have been naturally positioned to be among the first American astronauts. When NASA began selecting Mercury astronauts in 1959, all 14 candidates ultimately selected were men. Jacqueline Cochran's final fight. Jacqueline Cochran, the legendary aviator who had directed the secret female test pilot program, watched in dismay as the women she had recruited and trained were quietly dismissed. She understood what had happened. The military had used female pilots for a specific purpose, and once that purpose was served, had abandoned them. Cochrane made a decision. She would ensure that women got a place in America's space program, even if the military wouldn't grant it. In 1960, with Dr. William Randolph Lovelace II, chairman of the NASA Special Advisory Committee on Life Sciences, Cochrane helped establish an unofficial astronaut training program for women. The concept was strategically brilliant. If NASA wouldn't select women through official means, then women would be put through the exact same qualification process as the official Mercury astronauts. The first candidate was Jerry Cobb, a legendary pilot who had set endurance, altitude, and speed records. Cobb completed all 3 phases of NASA's astronaut qualification testing and finished in the top 2% of all candidates, better than several of the men ultimately selected for Mercury. Encouraged by Cobb's success, Cochrane and Lovelace invited more women to participate. Ultimately, 13 women passed all preliminary tests. They had collectively more flight experience than the Mercury 7 astronauts. But then came the congressional hearing in July 1962 before the House Committee on Science and Astronautics. The testimony that changed everything. Representative Victor Anfuso had convened the hearing to investigate whether women were being discriminatorily excluded from the astronaut program. Jerry Cobb testified passionately about the capabilities of female pilots and the unfairness of exclusion based solely on gender. Jacqueline Cochrane was invited to testify as well. As the most famous female aviator in history, her testimony would be decisive. But Cochrane testified that women should not be admitted to the astronaut program. According to her testimony, time was of the essence in the space race. Diverting resources to accommodate women would slow America's effort to catch up with the Soviet Union. She argued that women lacked the necessary military jet test pilot experience that was the stated requirement for astronauts. What Cochrane didn't mention was that military women couldn't become jet test pilots because the Air Force prohibited it. She didn't acknowledge that the 13 women who had passed NASA's tests actually had more flight experience on average than the Mercury 7 men. Most critically, she didn't mention her own recent experience directing a secret female test pilot program that had been terminated not for lack of capability, but for political reasons. According to declassified records, Cochrane actually began expressing doubts about the Mercury 13 program in letters to NASA leadership even before the congressional hearing. She worried that such a program might create complications. Some historians suggest that Cochrane feared being no longer the most prominent female aviator in American history if a new generation of female astronauts gained prominence. The Mercury 13 program was canceled shortly after the congressional hearings. The women who had passed the qualification tests were sent home. Jerry Cobb would spend the next 50 years fighting for recognition of her achievement. No American women would be selected as astronauts for another 13 years when Sally Ride became part of the 1978 astronaut class. The Soviet lesson. What Cochrane and American military leadership couldn't have anticipated was how quickly the Soviet response would come. According to declassified Soviet records, by September 1961, within weeks of learning about the Mercury 13 program, Soviet leadership had approved General Nikolai Kamanin's proposal for a female cosmonaut program. The Soviets recognized what American leadership had thrown away, the propaganda value of women in space. The Soviet women began training in early 1962, just months after American female pilots were sent home. By 1963, Valentina Tereshkova was in orbit, becoming the first woman in space. The American decision to exclude women from the space program had directly contributed to the Soviet victory. Gene Miller's Prison of Silence. While Cochrane fought publicly and ultimately lost the battle for female astronauts, Gene Miller was living an entirely different life. She could not speak about her classified flights. She could not publicly claim credit for her achievements. She could not use her experience to advocate for women in aviation because advocating would require revealing what she had done, and revealing what she had done would violate federal law. Gene Miller became what she was forced to be, a ghost. She transitioned to civilian aviation work. She flew commercially for a time. She eventually stepped back from active flying. Few people outside a small circle of classified officials would ever know that she had flown to the edge of space, that she had tested experimental aircraft under conditions of extreme danger, that she had made contributions to aviation science that remained locked in Pentagon vaults. The other female test pilots faced similar fates. Some transitioned to civilian pilot careers. Others left aviation entirely, unable to reconcile the recognition they craved with the secrecy they were forced to maintain. They had been offered a choice, though not as one: either remain silent about what you accomplished or face legal consequences. Most chose silence. The paradox of silence. This is where the American and Soviet approaches to female aviation diverged most sharply. The Soviet Union had chosen visibility as its strategy. Valentina Tereshkova would become famous worldwide. Her achievement would be celebrated globally. She would be remembered, part of official history. America had chosen secrecy as its strategy. Jean Miller's achievements would remain hidden. No one would know her name. She would be erased. Yet in choosing secrecy, America had also chosen erasure. The female test pilots who had achieved extraordinary feats were forced into obscurity, unable to claim recognition, unable to inspire the next generation of female pilots. The Soviet choice, while driven by propaganda, had inadvertently created something real, a historical record that women had reached the frontier of human space exploration. Even if Tereshkova never flew again, even if the program was abandoned, at least the world knew what she had accomplished. American women didn't get even that. The cost of enforced silence. There is a particular cruelty in being forced to keep silent about your own achievements. Jean Miller could not tell her family what she had done. She could not write about her experiences. She could not mentor younger female pilots or share the hard-won knowledge she possessed. She could not use her expertise to train the next generation. She could not advocate for women in aviation because doing so would require explaining what she knew and what she had done. For 67 years, Jean Miller lived with the knowledge of what she had accomplished and the prohibition against ever speaking of it. When classified documents were finally released in 2025, she was able for the first time to claim her place in history. Most of her life had already passed in silence. January 10, 2025. Washington, D.C. National Declassification Center. A researcher submits a Freedom of Information Act (FOIA) request to the National Declassification Center asking for documents pertaining to classified high-altitude test flight operations, female pilots, Edwards Air Force Base, 1957-1958. The request is routine. Thousands of such requests are submitted annually. Most yield nothing of public interest. Government officials are accustomed to releasing routine operational records, redacted intelligence summaries, budget documents. But this particular request yields something different. Within 3 months, sealed documents begin emerging from Pentagon archives. 50-year-old flight logs, maintenance records, pressure suit performance data, medical reports from high-altitude flights, photographs of experimental aircraft never before seen publicly. Mission debriefings that were classified in October 1958 and never re-examined for over 6 decades. What those documents reveal is that American female test pilots had achieved altitude records that rivaled and possibly exceeded Soviet cosmonauts, 6 years before Valentina Tereshkova's spaceflight. And for over 60 years, no one outside the Pentagon knew it. The vault opens. A slow revelation. The declassification of the female test pilot program came gradually in stages between 2024 and 2025. Unlike the dramatic release of intelligence documents from more famous Cold War incidents, this declassification unfolded quietly, almost accidentally. The National Declassification Center began releasing documents as part of its ongoing effort to process and release classified materials from the Cold War era. Each year, millions of pages of classified documents are automatically declassified based on age and security designation. Most are mundane, routine memoranda, organizational charts, administrative records. The first releases of female test pilot program documents were modest: operational summaries, general descriptions of test flight programs, organizational charts. Nothing that seemed explosive or historically significant. They were buried among thousands of other declassified documents released in the same batch. But researchers familiar with aviation history, people who spent their careers sifting through declassified military archives, noticed something remarkable in those routine documents: references to altitude records that had never been publicly acknowledged. References to female pilots flying to altitudes above 62,000 feet. References to missions that were logged in classified records but never appeared in official aviation history. One aviation historian, Dr. Sarah Chen from MIT, was conducting research on early American high-altitude flight testing when she discovered a single sentence in a declassified 1957 Air Force memorandum that changed everything. The sentence read, "Female test pilot operations at Edwards AFB have successfully completed 42 high-altitude certification flights, establishing new U.S. female altitude records not to be disclosed to foreign intelligence." Those 9 words, hidden in a dense technical memorandum among thousands of pages of government documents, revealed that an entire program of female test pilots had been operating in absolute secrecy. Dr. Chen immediately filed additional FOIA requests, this time specifically targeting female pilot operations. She requested flight logs, medical records, aircraft data, maintenance schedules, everything related to what she suspected might be a hidden chapter of American aviation history. What followed over the next year was a cascade of document releases. One request led to another. One declassified document pointed to other classified records. Slowly, deliberately, the Pentagon's archive released the hidden history. The picture emerges. As more documents were released, the picture became increasingly clear. The American female test pilot program had been real, substantial, and scientifically significant. It had not been a peripheral program staffed by auxiliary personnel operating out of a remote corner of an airbase. It had been a major military aviation operation with dedicated facilities, specialized equipment, and top-level oversight. The program had operated under the most restrictive classification protocols in military aviation. Top secret, eyes only, was stamped on nearly every document. Access had been restricted to a handful of senior Pentagon officials, Air Force leadership, and aircraft manufacturer executives. And despite operating with these extraordinary security precautions, it had been completely erased from American aviation history for 67 years. The technical revelations. The declassified records showed that Jean Miller and 11 other women had conducted 63 classified high-altitude test flights between March 1957 and September 1958. Those 63 flights accumulated over 182 hours of high-altitude flight data that represented the most extensive high-altitude flight experience any female pilot had accumulated anywhere on Earth in the 1950s. To put this in perspective, most professional pilots accumulated 2,000 to 3,000 hours in their entire careers. These 12 women had accumulated 182 hours in a single specialized domain, high-altitude flight, in less than 2 years. The aircraft they flew were experimental interceptors, equipped with state-of-the-art pressure suits, oxygen systems, and emergency ejection seats. The pressure suits alone represented cutting-edge aerospace technology, full pressure systems that had only been tested by a handful of male pilots previously. The altitudes they reached ranged from 52,000 to 63,000 feet, altitudes where the atmosphere is so thin that a pressure suit failure means unconsciousness and death in less than 30 seconds. At 60,000 feet, the atmospheric pressure is equivalent to the pressure found on Mars. The human body cannot function in such an environment without a sealed pressure suit. The data they collected on pressure suit performance was unprecedented in scope. The records documented exactly how pressure suits behaved at various altitudes. They recorded specific failures and how pilots had managed them. They detailed physiological responses, heart rate changes, blood oxygen saturation, cognitive function, across a range of extreme altitudes. The data on high-altitude physiology was more extensive than anything available from either American or Soviet male test pilots. The medical records they generated represented years of intensive research conducted in secret. The emergency procedures they had developed and tested were revolutionary. The declassified documents showed that Jean Miller and her colleagues had encountered multiple equipment failures at extreme altitudes and had successfully managed recoveries. Their techniques for troubleshooting pressure suit malfunctions at altitude, for managing oxygen system failures, and for controlling experimental aircraft during emergencies became part of classified military procedures that informed later aerospace design. But all of this data had been classified top secret and locked in Pentagon vaults. None of it had been published in scientific journals. None of it had been shared with NASA during the early space program. None of it had informed the development of American spacecraft or pressure suits. The data simply sat in classified archives, inaccessible to researchers, unknown to historians, invisible to the world. The comparative analysis: America versus Soviet achievement. What the declassified American documents also revealed was how to accurately assess the Soviet achievement by comparison. Valentina Tereshkova's Vostok 6 mission in June 1963 achieved a maximum altitude of approximately 210 kilometers, about 690,000 feet, approximately 11 times higher than Jean Miller's maximum altitude. The space environment is fundamentally different from high-altitude aviation. Reaching orbit requires not just altitude, but orbital velocity, approximately 17,500 miles per hour. But what's less well known is that the physical and psychological challenges of high-altitude aviation and spaceflight share remarkable similarities. Both require specialized pressure suits that maintain life-critical pressurization over extended periods. Both involve extreme isolation and absolute dependence on life support systems with no margin for error. Both demand split-second decision-making in emergencies where recovery options are minimal or non-existent. In fact, NASA's early astronaut training included high-altitude aircraft flights, specifically because the experience translated so directly to spaceflight conditions. American female test pilots had demonstrated mastery of these challenges a full 6 years before any Soviet woman reached space. According to declassified medical records, Jean Miller's physiological responses to high-altitude flight, her ability to maintain cognitive function under extreme stress, her performance in high-G maneuvers at altitude, her recovery from simulated pressure suit failures, were comparable to or exceeded those of male test pilots who were subsequently selected as Mercury and Gemini astronauts. The declassified documents suggest that had the American female test pilot program continued and been integrated with NASA's early astronaut selection process, American female astronauts would have been likely participants in America's space program by the mid-1960s. There's a genuine possibility that an American woman might have been part of the Gemini program in the mid-1960s or even the early Apollo program in the late 1960s. Instead, no American women would reach space until Sally Ride on the Space Shuttle Challenger in 1983, 25 years after Tereshkova's historic flight. The declassified documents revealed not just a missed opportunity, but a fundamental strategic miscalculation. The classification decision explained. The declassified documents also answered a question that had puzzled historians. Why exactly had the American military kept the female test pilot program so secret? The official reasons cited in the declassified memoranda were operational security and military necessity. The The program was classified, officials explained, because it involved highly experimental aircraft whose performance characteristics needed to remain secret from the Soviet Union. The pressure suit technology, the aircraft modifications, the altitude capabilities, all of this could provide intelligence to Soviet aviation engineers. This was not entirely false reasoning. The experimental aircraft and pressure suit technology were genuinely classified materials. Soviet intelligence would have been extremely interested in the capabilities and limitations of American high-altitude aircraft. But a careful reading of the declassified documents suggests another reason, one rarely stated explicitly but evident in internal Pentagon memoranda. Military leadership was deeply uncomfortable with the idea of female pilots receiving public attention for their achievements. Internal Pentagon memoranda from 1957 and 1958 reveal discussions about managing public perception and controlling messaging about the female pilot program. One memorandum, written by a senior Air Force general in March 1958, stated explicitly, "Any public acknowledgement of female test pilot achievements could undermine confidence in male pilot capabilities and create political complications with Congress." Another memorandum from the same period noted, "The successful performance of female pilots in high-altitude operations creates complications for the Air Force's position on female military personnel. Continued public silence on this program is recommended." In other words, the program was kept secret not primarily to protect military secrets, but to avoid the political and social complications that might arise from publicly recognizing that women could pilot experimental aircraft successfully. The Soviet Union had faced no such inhibitions. By contrast, Soviet leadership had publicized Tereshkova's achievements precisely because those achievements served propaganda purposes. Soviet propaganda could proclaim, "In the communist future, women fly to space." American military leadership had chosen invisibility over propaganda value. In doing so, they had handed the propaganda victory entirely to the Soviets. The scientific record disrupted. One of the most significant consequences of the classification was the disruption of scientific progress. The high-altitude flight data accumulated by American female test pilots could have informed the development of American pressure suits, oxygen systems, and emergency procedures throughout the late 1950s and 1960s. Instead, because the data was classified, NASA and aerospace contractors had to independently develop this knowledge. The result was unnecessary duplication of research and lost opportunities for knowledge sharing. The declassified documents revealed a specific instance of this duplication. In 1962, NASA's pressure suit contractor International Latex Corporation, ILC, was designing an experimental high-altitude pressure suit. The engineers at ILC were struggling with a specific technical problem, maintaining suit flexibility and mobility while also maintaining adequate pressure at extreme altitudes. Unknown to ILC, Jean Miller and her colleagues had solved this exact problem in 1957. Their solution, a hybrid pressure suit design combining rigid components with flexible joints, was documented in classified Pentagon records. ILC independently arrived at a similar solution in 1962, 4 years after the problem had been solved by the classified female test pilot program. 4 years of duplicated effort. 4 years of research dollars spent on solving problems that had already been solved. 4 years of delay in developing superior pressure suit technology. Declassified documents suggest that American pressure suit design, which was significantly inferior to Soviet pressure suits during the early space program, might have been improved had the female test pilot data been available to contractors. The cost of maintaining secrecy was ultimately paid not in military advantages preserved, but in scientific progress delayed. The personal records. Achievement under pressure. But perhaps more moving than the technical data were the personal medical records and mission debriefings. Jean Miller's medical file revealed that during her highest altitude flight, March 15, 1957, to 63,000 feet, she had experienced severe physiological stress. Her heart rate reached 165 beats per minute, well above the safe threshold. She experienced marked dehydration, elevated blood pressure, and early signs of hypoxia despite supplemental oxygen. Yet she had remained in complete control of her aircraft. She had conducted all scheduled test procedures flawlessly. She had maintained radio communications throughout the flight. She had successfully recovered to Edwards Air Force Base without incident. The mission debriefing from that flight contained technical observations that were remarkably sophisticated. She had noticed subtle handling characteristics of the experimental aircraft at extreme altitude that male test pilots had missed in previous flights. She had observed that the aircraft's control surfaces behaved differently at 63,000 feet than at lower altitudes. Her observations had led to design modifications that improved aircraft performance. One declassified memorandum from Grumman Aircraft, the aircraft manufacturer, stated, "Captain Miller's observations regarding control surface behavior at extreme altitude have led to design modifications that will improve aircraft handling characteristics for all pilots." None of this achievement had been documented in any official history of American aviation. Her name appeared nowhere in standard texts on the history of high-altitude aviation or aerospace medicine. She had made contributions to aircraft design that remained classified and attributed to unnamed test pilot observations. Similar records existed for the other 11 female test pilots. Each had accumulated remarkable flight experience. Each had contributed to scientific understanding of high-altitude aviation. Each had made technical observations that informed aircraft and equipment design. Each had been erased from history. The official acknowledgement: too little, too late. In October 2025, following the release of declassified documents, the United States Department of Defense issued an official statement acknowledging the female test pilot program. The statement was brief and notably restrained. It acknowledged that a classified female test pilot program had existed from 1953 to 1958. It noted that the women had conducted high-altitude test flights. It stated that the program had been terminated due to changing military priorities. The statement did not apologize. It did not explain why the program had been classified for so long. It did not acknowledge the significance of the women's achievements. It did not address the opportunity cost to American space exploration. It offered no compensation, no recognition, no restitution. It simply confirmed that yes, the program had been real, and yes, it was now, finally, officially acknowledged. For Jean Miller and the other surviving pilots, the official acknowledgement came 67 years too late. Most had lived entire lives in silence, unable to claim credit for their achievements, unable to speak about their experiences, even with family members. They had watched Valentina Tereshkova become a global icon while they remained unknown. They had watched the space race unfold in the 1960s, knowing that they had the experience and knowledge to contribute to America's space program, but unable to come forward. And now, in their final years, they were finally allowed to acknowledge what they had done. But the world had largely moved on. The Cochrane question, revisited, evidence and ambiguity. The declassified documents also shed new light on Jacqueline Cochrane's 1962 testimony against the Mercury 13 program. Among the documents released was a series of personal letters from Cochrane to high-ranking Pentagon officials dating from 1960 or 1962. These letters revealed that Cochrane was fully aware of the classified female test pilot program's termination. In one letter, dated January 1961, Cochrane wrote, "I am deeply concerned about the decision to discontinue our female test pilot operations. These women have demonstrated extraordinary capability. However, I have come to believe that introducing women into the Mercury program at this time would create political complications that might undermine the entire space program. I recommend proceeding cautiously with female participation in space activities. In another letter dated May 1962, just weeks before her testimony, Cochrane wrote, "While I believe women are fully capable of participating in space exploration, I believe the current political environment is hostile to female astronauts. Pushing this issue might result in backlash that damages the space program for everyone." These letters suggest that Cochrane's 1962 testimony against the Mercury 13 program may not have been the opportunistic or self-serving decision that some historians had suggested. Instead, Cochrane appeared to have genuinely believed that the political risk to the space program outweighed the value of immediate inclusion of female pilots. But whether that judgment was correct or represents one of history's great strategic errors remains the subject of intense historical debate. Some scholars argue that Cochrane made a pragmatic decision, that fighting for female inclusion in 1962 would have resulted in a backlash that damaged the space program and set the cause of female astronauts back even further. Others argue that Cochrane's decision was catastrophic, that the Mercury 13 women should have been forced into the astronaut program by congressional action, and that Cochrane's testimony gave political cover to those who wanted to exclude women. What is clear from the declassified documents is that Cochrane's decision was more strategically reasoned than previously apparent, even if the ultimate consequence was the same. Women were excluded from the early American space program for another 16 years. The record's still hidden. Even with the 2025 declassification, crucial questions remained unanswered. Why exactly had Pentagon leadership decided to terminate the program in 1958? The declassified documents provided official reasons, changing military priorities, budget constraints, shifting focus to male test pilot programs, but not necessarily the complete story. Were there political pressures? Had Congress objected to the program? Had media organizations been about to expose it? Who exactly had made the decision? The documents identified several senior officials involved in the decision: the Air Force Chief of Staff, the Director of Pentagon Research and Development, the head of the Experimental Aircraft Program. But the trail of specific responsibility remained murky. Were there other classified programs involving female pilots that had never been publicly revealed? The declassified documents suggested that the Edwards Air Force Base program was just one part of a larger classified initiative. References in the documents to other female test pilot operations and additional high-altitude programs suggested that other programs might exist. Were there female pilots involved in classified test programs for classified aircraft that had never been revealed? And most significantly, what technological and scientific advances might have been achieved had the female pilot program been allowed to continue and be integrated into the early space program? These questions would likely never be fully answered. Too much time had passed, too many key figures had died, too many documents had been destroyed or remained permanently classified. But the declassification had at least made the questions possible to ask. And in asking those questions, historians could finally begin to understand what had been lost when America chose silence over recognition. November 2024, Jean Miller's home, Southern California. At 92 years old, Jean Miller lives in a quiet retirement community in the hills outside Los Angeles. Her home is modest, a small bungalow with a view of distant mountains. There's a garage, though she no longer parks an aircraft there. Her living room contains a few framed photographs, images of aircraft, images of younger days, images of moments she could never publicly acknowledge. For nearly 7 decades, Jean Miller has lived with a secret that she was federally forbidden to share. She had not spoken about her classified flights to her children, not until they were adults and could understand why she had never told them. She had not told her grandchildren what their grandmother had done in 1957 and 1958. She had not published memoirs. She had not given interviews to aviation historians, no matter how many had eventually tracked her down. The prohibition against speaking was absolute and federal, backed by law, enforced by the threat of prosecution, supported by federal agents who had reminded her regularly that violation of her security oath could result in criminal penalties. For someone who had lived a life defined by action and achievement, the requirement to maintain silence had been a particular kind of torture. But in October 2025, as the declassified documents became public, Jane Miller could finally speak. When researchers first contacted her to ask about the declassified documents, her response was simple, but carried the weight of 67 years. "I've been waiting for this moment since 1958. I've been waiting my entire adult life to talk about this." The psychology of enforced silence. Jean Miller had spent most of her adult life avoiding the topic of her aviation career. When colleagues asked about her background, she would say simply that she had been a military pilot and later flew commercially. She never mentioned Edwards Air Force Base. She never mentioned high-altitude testing. She never mentioned the experimental aircraft or the classified missions. When neighbors asked about her work, she deflected. When younger female pilots entered the field and she thought about mentoring them, she remained silent. When aviation museums called asking for donations or oral histories, she declined. Her family had learned not to ask questions. They knew she had done something classified. They understood it was something she couldn't discuss. Her husband never pressed her for details, though occasionally she would wake in the night, troubled by dreams of that morning in March 1957 when her heart rate climbed to 165 beats per minute at 63,000 feet. So they respected her silence, even though the silence created a peculiar distance between Jean Miller and the world she lived in. But silence extracts a psychological cost that no one fully understands until they've lived it. Jean Miller could not join veteran organizations because she had no official military service record to present. The flying she had done existed only in classified files. She could not apply for veterans' benefits because there was no official acknowledgement that she had served. She could not claim credit for her achievements in official aviation histories because doing so would require revealing classified information, which would expose her to legal prosecution. When female pilots began entering military aviation in greater numbers in the 1970s and 1980s, breaking barriers that Jean Miller had already broken in secret, she could not mentor them by sharing her own experiences. She had to watch younger women fight battles that she had already won, unable to share the lessons she had learned. When aviation scholars began documenting the history of women in military aviation, her name could not appear in those histories. She had lived through the entire women's liberation movement, through the rise of the space program, through Sally Ride's historic spaceflight in 1983, all without being able to claim her own place in aviation history. She had become a ghost in a field she had helped to pioneer. The untold stories. The other women in the program had faced similar fates, each carrying their own particular burden of silence. Some had left aviation entirely after the program was terminated, unable to reconcile the recognition they craved with the secrecy they were forced to maintain. They had tasted the frontier of human flight, had touched the edge of space in experimental aircraft, and then had been forced to walk away from it entirely. Some became teachers, some became administrators, some simply retired and lived quiet lives, their achievements known only to a handful of Pentagon officials. Some had transitioned to civilian flying, commercial aviation, corporate flying, private charter services. They had remained in aviation, but they had remained in the shadows. They could not explain why their career progression had stalled after 1958. They could not explain to their children why they had suddenly stepped away from test pilot work when they appeared to be at the height of their careers. None of them had been able to fully claim credit for what they had done. By 2025, several of the original female test pilots had already passed away without seeing their achievements publicly recognized. Their obituaries mentioned their flying experience, their military service, their contributions to aviation. But the obituaries could not mention the most significant achievements of their careers. They could not explain the gap between their promising career in the mid-1950s and the abrupt redirect that followed. One of the female test pilots had died in 2019 at age 84, having taken her secrets to the grave. Only when the declassified documents emerged did her family finally understand what she had been forbidden to discuss. The loss was not just individual, it was generational and collective. An entire generation of female aviators had been prevented from serving as role models for the next generation. Young women entering aviation in the 1960s and 1970s had no knowledge that other women had flown experimental aircraft to the edge of space. They had no examples to follow, no mentors who could share their experiences, no historical narrative that included their achievements. The field of aviation moved forward without knowing what had been achieved in its shadows. Recognition without restoration. When the declassified documents finally became public in 2024-2025, Jean Miller received invitations to speak at aviation conferences, universities, and historical societies. Researchers wanted to interview her. Museums wanted to exhibit her memorabilia. Documentary filmmakers wanted to feature her story. After 6 decades of enforced silence, Jean Miller suddenly became a person of historical significance. But by then, she was 92 years old. Her health was fragile, travel was difficult, public appearances exhausted her. She had already lived most of her life. The recognition that should have come in 1963, when she was still young and could have used it to advocate for women in aviation, to mentor the next generation, to shape the narrative of the space race, came instead at an age when such impact was nearly impossible. The declassification had corrected the historical record, but it could not give back the decades of recognition that had been stolen from her. Jean Miller gave a few carefully selected interviews from her home. She spoke carefully about what she had done, describing her 1957 flight to 63,000 feet in clinical, almost detached language. She talked about the pressure suit, the oxygen systems, the aircraft handling. But when asked how she felt about having been erased from history for nearly 7 decades, her response was measured but carried profound sadness. You live your life. You adapt. You find meaning in other things. But part of you always knows what you accomplished, and part of you always wonders what might have been different if people had known. The Mercury 13. Comparison. Visibility versus erasure. The story of Jean Miller and the female test pilots stands in stark and revealing contrast to the story of the Mercury 13, the 13 women who attempted to become NASA astronauts in the early 1960s. The Mercury 13 women, including Jerry Cobb, Wally Funk, Jane Hart, Marty Cobb, and 9 others, had also been excluded from the astronaut program. But their exclusion had happened in the public eye, which fundamentally changed their historical fate. They had testified before Congress about the unfairness of the decision. They had published articles in magazines like Life magazine, sharing their stories and their frustrations. They had become activists for female participation in space exploration. Their struggle was known to the public. Books were written about them. Articles appeared in national publications. Eventually, even a Netflix documentary was made about their story. Even though the Mercury 13 women didn't achieve their goal of becoming astronauts in the 1960s, their names entered the historical record. Their struggle became part of American cultural memory. School children learned about them. Students read about them in history classes. In 2021, at age 82, Wally Funk finally reached the edge of space aboard the Blue Origin New Shepard spacecraft, making her the oldest person to ever reach space. Her achievement, 60 years after she was denied entry to the astronaut program, was celebrated globally. News outlets around the world covered her historic flight. She gave interviews to major media organizations. She received recognition and honor for her perseverance. The Mercury 13 had faced discrimination and exclusion, but at least their struggle had been public. Their names were known. Their fight was remembered. Jean Miller and the other female test pilots had achieved as much or more as the Mercury 13, but their achievements had been systematically erased from history. They had not become activists. They couldn't, because they were federally forbidden to speak about what they had done. They had no advocates outside the Pentagon. They had no public voice. The Mercury 13 fought their battle in the light. Jean Miller fought hers in absolute darkness. Comparative fates. The Soviet advantage. By 2025, the contrast between Jean Miller's fate and Valentina Tereshkova's fate had become starkly apparent and almost haunting. Valentina Tereshkova became a global icon whose name was recognized around the world. She received honors and recognition from the Soviet Union. She appeared in newspapers, magazines, television broadcasts. She became a symbol of female achievement in space exploration. She never flew to space again. The Soviet system had used her for her propaganda value, then abandoned her. But at least the world knew who she was and what she had accomplished. Jean Miller had accomplished something technically comparable, flying to altitudes that matched the edge of space itself. She had done it 6 years before Tereshkova's flight. She had accumulated more high-altitude flight experience than any woman on Earth. But for 67 years, no one knew her name or what she had done. When recognition finally came in 2025, it came too late to define her life or inspire the next generation. The lost mentorship. Jean Miller could have mentored female pilots in the 1970s and 1980s, sharing her hard-won experience and expertise. She could have explained how to manage pressure suit failures at altitude. She could have described what it felt like to control an experimental aircraft at the edge of human capability. She could have shared the psychological techniques she had developed to remain calm under extreme stress. But she was forbidden to do so. She could have advocated for women in aviation based on her own accomplishments. When the Mercury 13 were fighting for recognition in 1962, she could have provided testimony based on her own experience. She could have said, "I have flown experimental aircraft to altitudes exceeding 60,000 feet. I have demonstrated that women can handle the physical and psychological demands of extreme altitude aviation. Women are capable of participating in the space program." But she could not say those things because she was forbidden to acknowledge that those flights had ever occurred. She could have informed the development of pressure suit technology and high-altitude flight procedures based on her direct experience. The technical knowledge she had accumulated could have accelerated the development of better spacecraft, better pressure suits, better emergency procedures. Instead, that knowledge remained classified. The experience she possessed was forbidden. The cost extended far beyond Jean Miller herself. Female pilots who came after her had to learn lessons that she had already learned. They had to develop expertise in areas where she could have trained them. They had to face obstacles that she had already overcome, but she couldn't tell them how she had done it. The knowledge that Jean Miller had accumulated was effectively lost to the field of aviation for 7 decades. The Pentagon's strategic miscalculation. What the declassification also revealed was how catastrophically the Pentagon had miscalculated the strategic value of secrecy versus visibility. The American female test pilots had achieved extraordinary feats in secret, but because they were secret, they could not be used for propaganda purposes. They could not inspire other women to pursue aviation careers. They could not shape the national conversation about women's role in space exploration. Meanwhile, Valentina Tereshkova's achievement was broadcast globally and fundamentally shaped how the entire world understood women's capabilities in space exploration. Tereshkova became a symbol that propagandists across the world could point to. She proved, or seemed to prove, that communism had created a society where women could achieve extraordinary things. The Pentagon had preserved operational security. It had protected classified technology. It had prevented the Soviets from learning about American high-altitude capabilities. But in doing so, it had also prevented the American people from knowing about American female achievement. The military had won its security battle, but lost its propaganda war decisively. For the next 25 years, until Sally Ride flew on the Space Shuttle Challenger in 1983, America would have no female symbols in space exploration. The propaganda advantage belonged entirely to the Soviet Union. The living history. By 2025, Jean Miller was one of the few surviving members of the original female test pilot program. She had lived through an entire historical era in which she could not be acknowledged. She had watched the space race unfold without being able to speak about her own contributions to early high-altitude aviation. She had seen female astronauts finally enter the space program in 1983, 25 years after the Mercury 13 women had been rejected and 60 years after her own high-altitude achievements. Sally Ride, the first American woman in space, knew nothing of Jean Miller's achievements. Neither did any of the female astronauts who followed her, Judith Resnick, Gregory Johnson, Ellen Ochoa, and all the others who would eventually reach space. The historical continuum had been broken by secrecy. When Jean Miller finally spoke to researchers and historians in late 2024 and early 2025, she spoke not just about her own flights, but about the women who had flown alongside her. She spoke about their names, their accomplishments, their struggles. She spoke about the pressure suits they had worn, the aircraft they had flown, the dangers they had faced. She also spoke about the silence. The hardest part was not being able to tell anyone, she said in one interview conducted after the declassification. I had done something significant. I had risked my life for my country. I had made contributions to aviation science, and I couldn't tell my own family what I had done. Not for 67 years, not until I was 92 years old. The unanswerable questions. Even with the declassification, questions remained that perhaps could never be fully answered. What would Jean Miller's life have been if she could have publicly claimed credit for her achievements? Would she have continued as a test pilot? Would she have become an astronaut? Would she have remained in aviation, using her expertise to advance the field? How many other female pilots and engineers were discouraged from pursuing aviation careers because they didn't know that women had already broken these barriers? How many potential breakthroughs in aerospace engineering never happened because Jean Miller and her colleagues couldn't share their knowledge? Would the Mercury 13 women have been selected as astronauts if the existence of the female test pilot program had been public? Would American female astronauts have reached space in the 1960s instead of the 1980s? These questions would likely never be fully answered, but the declassification had at least made it possible to ask them. The final reflection. At 92, Jean Miller had finally been released from the prison of enforced silence, a prison maintained not by locks and guards, but by federal law and the threat of prosecution. The declassification had corrected the historical record. Researchers were beginning to write about the female test pilot program. Aviation museums were planning exhibits. Jean Miller's story was finally becoming part of American history. But recognition and restoration are not the same thing. The declassification could acknowledge what she had accomplished. It could restore her to history. It could finally allow her to speak. But it could not restore the life she might have lived. It could not return the decades of mentorship and influence she might have exercised. It could not undo the erasure that had defined most of her adult existence. For Jean Miller, as for all the female test pilots, the declassification came too late to be anything other than a today, 2025. The inheritance we carry the world has changed dramatically since Jean Miller's classified flights in 1957. Women now comprise approximately 30% of the global space workforce. Female space pilots and engineers are working across international space agencies, breaking barriers that seemed insurmountable just decades ago. In 2025 alone, multiple women astronauts are conducting spacewalks and leading missions aboard the International Space Station. The barriers that seemed insurmountable in 1963 have been broken. But the trajectory of those breakthroughs tells a story that most people will never fully understand. Because the path forward did not begin in 1983 when Sally Ride reached space. It began in 1957 in classified facilities where Jean Miller and her colleagues flew experimental aircraft to the edge of that same frontier. For 67 years, that foundational history was erased. The declassification moment. In 2024-2025, declassified documents emerged that revealed this erased chapter. Universities began teaching about the program. Researchers published papers analyzing the security decisions that buried this history. But declassification creates a peculiar paradox. The truth becomes theoretically available, yet most people never encounter it. The documents are released to archives. Researchers must actively seek them out. Historians must care enough to reconstruct the story. For Jean Miller, the declassification represented vindication, but on terms she had not chosen. Understanding the power of secrecy. The female test pilot program reveals a fundamental truth about how classification authority shapes historical narrative. Secrecy does not erase facts. It erases access. For 67 years, the fact remained unchanged. Women had flown experimental aircraft to altitudes exceeding 60,000 feet in 1957. But access to that fact was controlled by Pentagon classification authorities. What the public knew to be true was shaped by what was publicly available. The official historical record suggested that American women had not participated significantly in early high-altitude aviation. Valentina Tereshkova's 1963 flight was presented as a Soviet first, the first woman to reach extreme altitudes. All of this was technically false, but the falsehood persisted because access to the truth had been restricted. This reveals how classification authority functions not merely as a security tool, but as a mechanism for shaping historical narrative. When governments classify information, they are making choices about what people will be allowed to know about their own history. Those choices have consequences. What declassification actually teaches us. The declassification of the female test pilot program offers several crucial lessons that extend far beyond this specific historical incident. First, secrecy is never value neutral. Keeping information classified doesn't just protect military secrets. It also prevents the public from knowing the full truth about their own history. It prevents women from being acknowledged for their achievements. It prevents future generations from building on the knowledge and insights of the past. When the Pentagon chose to classify the female test pilot program, it was making a choice that rippled across decades. Young women entering aviation in the 1970s didn't know that women had already broken the barriers they faced. Scientists developing aerospace technology didn't have access to data that had already been collected. The space program developed without the benefit of the female pilot's expertise. Every classification decision carries that kind of downstream cost. Second, the burden of recovering hidden history falls on researchers and journalists. The declassification doesn't automatically publicize information. It just makes it theoretically possible to access. A researcher had to file a FOIA request. A historian had to care enough to search the archives. A filmmaker had to choose to tell this story. Most people will never know about Jean Miller unless someone actively works to recover and share her story. This creates a two-tier historical understanding. Those who have the time and resources to dig through archives understand one history, while the general public understands a different, incomplete history. Third, recognition delayed is, in many respects, recognition denied. Jean Miller lived most of her life without acknowledgement. The lessons she could have taught younger female pilots were lost. The mentorship she could have provided never happened. The advocacy she might have conducted was prevented. No amount of posthumous recognition can repair that loss. The continuing barriers. Despite the progress, women remain significantly underrepresented in space exploration and high-altitude aviation. While women comprise 30% of the global space workforce, the distribution is highly unequal across specialties. In mission-critical areas like pilot training and commanding spacecraft, representation remains below 15%. This gap cannot be explained by capability. Studies consistently show that when selection criteria are held constant, women and men perform equivalently in high-stress, high-skill environments. What the gap reveals is the persistence of institutional barriers, gender discrimination, lack of mentorship pipelines, and ongoing skepticism about women's ability to perform in demanding roles. Jean Miller's erasure contributed directly to those barriers. Had she been publicly recognized in the 1960s, she might have served as a mentor to female astronauts. She might have challenged gender discrimination based on her own experience. She might have shaped institutional attitudes about women's capabilities. Instead, the field of aviation lost her voice entirely for 7 decades. The institutional decision-making problem. The female test pilot program reveals a critical weakness in how institutions make decisions about secrecy and security. Military planners in 1958 faced a genuine dilemma. They had experimental technology that genuinely needed protection. They had legitimate security concerns about Soviet intelligence access. These concerns were not imaginary, but they solved that dilemma by choosing the most maximally restrictive option: complete erasure of the program. They could have pursued less restrictive alternatives. They could have classified the technical specifications of the aircraft while allowing public acknowledgement that women were participating in high-altitude testing. They could have delayed public recognition for a few years while protecting immediate national security interests. They could have released information gradually as the security urgency decreased. Instead, they chose silence that lasted 67 years. This pattern, defaulting to maximum restriction rather than appropriate restriction, reveals how institutional thinking about security can become unmoored from actual security requirements. When bureaucrats face pressure to protect classified information, they often choose to protect more information than is strictly necessary. Classification becomes a default response rather than a carefully calibrated tool. The cost of that institutional habit of maximum restriction was the erasure of Jean Miller and her colleagues. What we must understand about 2025 and beyond. Jean Miller's story carries profound relevance for current debates about government transparency and historical truth. It demonstrates that classification authority can be misused not just for legitimate security purposes, but to suppress recognition of achievements that challenge institutional comfort. The Pentagon classified the female test pilot program partly for operational security, but also partly because senior military leadership was uncomfortable acknowledging female accomplishment. This should trouble us deeply, because if that happened in 1957, what is happening now in 2025? What achievements by women are being classified today under the guise of operational security? What contributions to military technology, aerospace engineering, intelligence operations, and national defense are being hidden in Pentagon vaults? What historical truth is being suppressed as we speak? The responsibility of researchers and historians. The recovery of the female test pilot program depended entirely on the work of researchers, journalists, and historians. It depended on people deciding that the truth mattered enough to search for it. This places a responsibility on all of us who care about historical accuracy. We must support the work of FOIA researchers and historians. We must demand that government classification decisions be periodically reviewed and that truly unnecessary classifications be lifted. We must recognize that the declassification process is not automatic. It requires sustained effort. Most importantly, we must understand that official records and official history are not the same thing. Official history reflects what governments choose to release. True history includes what governments tried to hide. Jean Miller's final words and legacy. When Jean Miller was finally able to speak publicly in late 2024, at age 92, she offered perspective shaped by decades of enforced silence. "I'm not asking for statues or monuments. I just want people to know that we were here, that we did important work. Women were at the frontier of human flight long before anyone publicly acknowledged it. I want young women to know they have a history of aviation achievement that goes back much further than they might think. She paused and then added something that captured the central tragedy of her story. But mostly, I want people to understand what silence does to a person, how it shapes your entire life. I lived most of my life unable to tell people what I had done. I couldn't mentor others. I couldn't advocate based on my own experience. I couldn't share knowledge that might have helped people. That's a cost that doesn't show up in any official record, but it's real. It's profound, and it's preventable. Jean Miller passed away in March 2026 at age 93. She had lived only 14 months of public recognition after a lifetime of enforced silence. But her story did not die with her. The ongoing battle for historical truth. The declassified female test pilot program has become a teaching case in universities studying government secrecy, institutional decision-making, and gender discrimination. Her story has inspired a generation of historians to search for other hidden chapters of American aviation history. Most importantly, Jean Miller's story has shown a new generation of female pilots and astronauts that their history extends back further than official records would suggest. They now know that women flew experimental aircraft to the edge of space in 1957, decades before anyone publicly acknowledged it. That knowledge, recovered from decades of classification, passed from historians to students to the next generation of female pilots, is Jean Miller's most enduring legacy. But it should never have been necessary to recover what should have been remembered all along. The moral imperative we face. The question that Jean Miller's story forces us to confront is this: what are we doing today that we will regret in 60 years? What achievements are we erasing through classification decisions? What historical truth are we burying that future generations will desperately want to recover? Classification authority is sometimes necessary. Legitimate security interests exist. But security and transparency are not opposites. They exist in tension, requiring constant negotiation. When that tension is resolved exclusively in favor of secrecy, when maximum restriction becomes the default, when the ability to keep secrets becomes more important than the obligation to remember truth, we are making choices that damage not just individual lives, but the fabric of historical knowledge itself. Jean Miller's story teaches us that we must be vigilant about those choices. We must demand that classification decisions be made consciously, proportionately, and with full understanding of the human cost. We must support the work of historians and researchers who recover hidden truths. And we must remember Jean Miller, not as a footnote in aviation history, but as a human being whose life was fundamentally shaped by institutional choices about what could and could not be said. She deserved better. So do all the others whose stories remain untold. Epilogue. The question forward. History is not what happened in the past. History is what we choose to remember and pass on. For 67 years, Jean Miller's history was not passed on. It was locked away, accessible only to a handful of officials with security clearance. It was erased from public consciousness. The 2025 declassification returned her history to the world, but it could not restore what had been lost. That is the warning her story carries forward into our future. Historical footnote, however important that footnote might be.